Emma had been walking through the endless desert for 3 long days. Her feet were covered in blisters that made every step feel like walking on broken glass. The old brown dress she wore was now torn in several places from catching on thorny bushes and rocks. Dust and dirt covered her from head to toe, making her look like she had become part of the desert itself 3 days ago. Emma had lived in a small boarding house in the nearby town of Cedar Creek. She worked as a seamstress, mending clothes for the townspeople and barely earning enough money to pay for her tiny room and simple meals. But when the boarding house owner decided to sell the building, Emma found herself with nowhere to go. She had no family, no friends who could help, and no savings to find another place to live. The people in town had not been kind to Emma. They saw her as an outsider because she had arrived in Cedar Creek only 2 years before. Running from troubles in her past, some of the women whispered about her behind her back, making up stories about why a young woman would travel alone. The men either ignored her completely or looked at her in ways that made her feel uncomfortable and unsafe. When Emma lost her room at the boarding house, she had asked several families if they needed help with cooking, cleaning, or sewing in exchange for a place to sleep. But door after door was closed in her face. Some people were polite but firm in their refusal. Others were cruel, telling her that they did not want someone like her on their families. With no other choice, Emma had gathered her few belongings in a small cloth bundle and started walking toward the next town, which was said to be about 50 miles away through the desert. She had hoped to find work and shelter there. But the journey was much harder than she had imagined. On the first day, Emma had felt hopeful. She walked steadily, stopping to rest in whatever shade she could find. She had brought a small bottle of water and a piece of bread, thinking it would be enough for the journey. But as the sun grew hotter and the miles stretched on, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. By the second day, her water was almost gone, and she had finished the bread. Her lips started to crack from the dry air, and her tongue felt thick in her mouth. The desert seemed to go on forever, with nothing but sand, rocks, and occasional scrubby bushes that offered no food or water. Emma began to worry that she had taken the wrong path, but she had no choice but to keep walking forward. The third day was the worst. Emma woke up feeling dizzy and weak. Her head pounded with each heartbeat, and her vision sometimes became blurry. She knew these were signs that her body was giving up, but she forced herself to keep moving. What else could she do? Going back to Cedar Creek meant facing the same rejection and cruelty. Moving forward might mean death, but at least it also meant hope. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, making the desert air shimmer with heat, Emma stumbled more often. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, and each breath was an effort. She tried to think of happy memories to keep herself going, but even those seemed to fade away in the overwhelming heat and exhaustion. When Emma reached the top of a small sandy hill, she looked out at the landscape ahead and felt her heart sink. There was still nothing but more desert stretching to the horizon. No buildings, no trees, no signs of water or life anywhere. She took another step forward, then another. But suddenly her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the hot sand. Emma tried to push herself up with her arms, but they shook with weakness and could not support her weight. She rolled over onto her back and stared up at the bright blue sky, feeling the sun burning her face. This was it, she thought. This was how her story would end, alone in the middle of nowhere, with no one to even know what had happened to her. But as Emma lay there, feeling sorry for herself and preparing to give up completely, she heard something that made her heart jump. It was the sound of horse hooves hitting the ground, getting closer and closer. At first, she thought it might be her imagination, a dream brought on by the heat and dehydration. But the sound grew louder and more real. Emma wanted to sit up and wave for help, but she was too weak to move. She could barely keep her eyes open. All she could do was lie there and listen to the approaching hoofbeats, hoping and praying that whoever was coming would be kind enough to help a stranger in desperate need. The sound stopped somewhere nearby, and Emma heard a man's voice calling out, though she could not understand the words through her foggy mind. Heavy footsteps approached her, and she felt a shadow fall across her face, blocking the burning sun. Maybe, just maybe, her luck was about to change. Thomas had started his morning the same way he had for the past 2 years, ever since his father passed away from a sudden illness. He saddled up Duke, his faithful brown horse who had been his companion through all the lonely days on the ranch. Duke was getting older now, with gray spots round his nose, but he was still strong and reliable. The morning air was cool and pleasant as Thomas rode out to check the fence lines that marked the bound areas of his family's land. This was something his father had taught him to do every day without fail. A broken fence could mean lost cattle, and lost cattle could mean the difference between having enough money to keep the ranch running or having to sell it to pay the bills. Thomas had inherited the ranch when he was only 23 years old. It was not a large spread compared to some of the bigger operations in the area, but it had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the original house and barn with his own hands, and his father had worked hard to expand the property and build up the cattle herd. Now Thomas was trying to keep everything running by himself, which was much harder than it looked. Some days he felt overwhelmed by all the work that needed to be done. He had to take care of the animals, fix broken equipment, manage the finances, and handle all the business dealings with buyers and suppliers. There was no time for friends or social activities, and certainly no time to think about finding a wife and starting a family. The loneliness was probably the hardest part of Thomas's life. He would go days without talking to another person except for brief conversations with the man who delivered supplies or the occasional neighbor who stopped by. In the evenings, he would sit on his front porch and eat his simple dinner alone, watching the sun set over the desert landscape. Thomas often thought about his parents and how happy they had been together. His mother had died when he was 16, and his father had never remarried. Now Thomas understood why his father had become so quiet and sad in his later years. Working alone and living alone was not natural for most people, but it seemed to be the life that had chosen Thomas. As Duke carried him over a familiar ridge that gave him a good view of the southern pasture, Thomas was thinking about whether he should try to buy a few more cattle this year or focus on improving the water system for the ones he already had. Money was always tight, and every decision felt important. That was when he saw something that did not belong in the empty desert landscape. At first, Thomas thought it might be a dead animal, perhaps a deer that had wandered too far from water. But as Duke got closer, Thomas realized with shock that it was a person lying motionless on the ground. Thomas spurred Duke into a gallop and reached the spot in less than a minute. He jumped down from his horse and knelt beside the figure, which he could now see was a young woman. Her clothes were torn and filthy. Her face was burned red from the sun, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. She was unconscious and breathing very slowly. Double quotes, miss. "Can you hear me?" Thomas called out, gently shaking her shoulder. The woman's eyelids fluttered slightly, but she did not respond with words. Thomas could tell that she was suffering from severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. If he did not get her help quickly, she might not survive much longer. Without wasting another second, Thomas carefully lifted the woman in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, probably because she had not eaten properly in days. He managed to get her onto Duke's back. holding her steady with one arm while he climbed up behind her. Duke seemed to understand the urgency of the situation and began moving toward home at a steady pace that would be fast but not so rough as to hurt the injured woman. The ride back to the ranch house took about 15 minutes, and Thomas spent the whole time worrying that the woman might die before he could help her. He could feel how hot her skin was with fever, and her breathing seemed to be getting weaker. He found himself talking to her, even though she could not hear him, telling her to hold on and that everything would be all right. When they reached the house, Thomas carried the woman inside and straight to his mother's old bedroom, which he had kept exactly as it was when she died. The room had a comfortable bed with clean sheets, and it was the coolest room in the house because it faced north and had good ventilation. Thomas gently placed the woman on the bed and then rushed to get cool water and clean cloths. He had learned basic first aid from his father, who had taught him that ranch life often meant being far from doctors and having to handle emergencies yourself. Thomas carefully cleaned the dirt and sand from the woman's face and hands, then helped her drink small sips of water. Over the next hour, the woman began to show signs of improvement. Her breathing became stronger, and some color returned to her face. Thomas found some of his mother's old dresses and left them on a chair beside the bed, thinking the woman would want clean clothes when she woke up. For the next 3 days, Thomas barely left the house, except to do the most essential chores. After 7 days of rest and Thomas's careful nursing, Emma finally felt strong enough to get out of bed and walk around the ranch house. Her strength had returned, and the color had come back to her cheeks. But more than anything, Emma felt overwhelmed by the kindness that Thomas had shown her. He had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. Not even her name or where she had come from. Emma could not bear the thought of being a burden on Thomas any longer. She knew he worked hard every day to keep his ranch running, and she wanted to find ways to help him. The problem was that Emma had never lived on a ranch before. She had grown up in towns and cities, working as a seamstress and sometimes as a maid in hotels. She knew nothing about cattle, horses, or farming, but Emma was determined to learn. On her first morning of feeling well, she woke up early and found Thomas in the kitchen making coffee and preparing to go out and feed the animals. She asked if she could come with him and help with the work. Thomas looked surprised but pleased, and he agreed to show her what needed to be done. The first job was feeding the chickens. Thomas had about 20 chickens that lived in a wooden coop behind the house. He showed Emma how to scatter the grain and corn for them to eat, and how to check their nesting boxes for eggs. Emma was delighted when she found 6 fresh eggs on her first try. The chickens seemed to like her immediately, clucking softly and following her on the yard. Next, Thomas taught Emma how to milk the cows. This was much harder than feeding chickens. The cows were large and intimidating, and Emma was afraid they might step on her or kick her. But Thomas was patient and gentle in his teaching. He showed her how to approach the cows calmly, how to position the bucket, and how to pull the milk from the udders with a steady rhythm. It took Emma several tries before she could get any milk at all, but she refused to give up. Within a few days, Emma had learned to do both jobs well. She discovered that she enjoyed working with the animals. There was something peaceful and satisfying about the simple, honest work. The animals did not judge her or ask questions about her past. They simply accepted her care and attention. Thomas was impressed by how quickly Emma learned and how hard she worked. He began teaching her other jobs around the ranch. He showed her how to repair wooden fence posts that had been damaged by weather or animals. Emma had good hands for detailed work from her years of sewing, and she proved to be excellent at mending things. Thomas also taught Emma how to brush and care for the horses. Duke, Thomas's brown horse, seemed especially fond of Emma. He would nigger softly when he saw her coming and nuzzle her hand looking for treats. Emma learned to saddle and bridle the horses. And eventually Thomas even taught her to ride Dot in the evenings. When the day's work was done, Emma and Thomas would sit together on the front porch of the house. This had become their favorite time of day. They would watch the sun set over the desert while they talked about their lives, their dreams and their fears. Emma told Thomas about her childhood dream of becoming a teacher. She had always loved books and learning, and she wanted to help children discover the joy of reading and knowledge. But her family had been poor, and there had been no money for the education she would need to become a teacher. Instead, she had learned to sew and had worked to support herself as best she could. Thomas shared his own dreams with Emma. He wanted to build his ranch back up to what it had been when his father was alive. In those days, they had owned twice as many cattle and had employed several ranch hands to help with the work. Thomas dreamed of having a prosperous operation that could support a family and provide a good life for everyone who lived there. Emma noticed that Thomas had many books in his house, some of which had belonged to his mother. She asked him to teach her to read better. Since her education had been limited, Thomas was happy to help, and he found that he enjoyed being a teacher. In return, Emma taught Thomas how to cook the wonderful meals that her grandmother had shown her when she was a child. Before Emma arrived, Thomas had been eating very simple food, mostly beans, bread, and whatever meat he could get from hunting or trading. But Emma knew how to make delicious stews, fresh bread, and even special desserts from basic ingredients. The kitchen, which had been cold and unused since Thomas's mother died, came alive again with wonderful smells and warm conversations. As the weeks passed, both Emma and Thomas began to change. The house felt different now, warmer, more welcoming, full of life and laughter. Emma made new curtains for the windows from fabric that Thomas bought for her in town. She planted a small vegetable garden behind the house, growing tomatoes, beans, and herbs that would make their meals even better. Thomas found himself working with more energy and enthusiasm than he had felt in years. With Emma's help, he was able to accomplish much more each day. He repaired the old barn, painted the house, and even bought some new cattle with money he had been saving. They both realized that something special was growing between them, something deeper than friendship, something that felt like coming home. As the hot summer days slowly gave way to autumn, Emma and Thomas had settled into a comfortable rhythm of working together on the ranch. The morning air was beginning to carry a slight coolness that made the work more pleasant, and the desert landscape was starting to show subtle changes in color as the seasons shifted. Emma had become an essential part of the daily operations. She could now milk the cows as efficiently as Thomas, and the chickens had grown so fond of her that they would come running whenever they heard her voice. She had also proven to be surprisingly good at handling the cattle, moving them from one pasture to another with a calm confidence that impressed Thomas greatly. Thomas, for his part, had become a different man since Emma arrived. The loneliness that had weighed on him for so long was completely gone. He found himself looking forward to each new day, not just because of the work that needed to be done, but because he would be sharing that work with Emma. He caught himself smiling more often, humming old songs while he worked, and feeling genuinely happy for the first time in years. Their evening conversations on the porch had become deeper and more personal as the weeks passed. They talked about their childhoods, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Emma shared stories about her grandmother, who had been the most important person in her early life. Thomas told Emma about his parents and how much he missed the sound of his mother's laughter filling the house, both of them began to realize that their feelings for each other were changing. What had started as gratitude and friendship was slowly becoming something much stronger and deeper. But neither Emma nor Thomas wanted to rush into anything or risk damaging the wonderful partnership they had built together. One evening in late September, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon as Emma and Thomas finished their daily chores. The air felt heavy and electric, and the cattle seemed restless and nervous. Thomas looked at the sky with concern and told Emma that they were about to experience one of the desert's famous autumn storms. By the time they had eaten their dinner, the wind was beginning to pick up strength. The first drops of rain started, falling just as they were clearing the dishes from the table. Within an hour, the storm had become a powerful force of nature that threatened everything on the ranch. The wind howled around the house, rattling the windows and doors. Rain poured down in sheets so thick that it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. But the worst part was the sound of distressed animals crying out in the darkness. The cattle were frightened and confused, and some of them had broken through a section of fence that had been weakened by the strong winds. Thomas knew that he had to go out into the storm to help the animals, even though it was dangerous. He put on his heaviest coat and hat and prepared to face the terrible weather. But as he reached for the door handle, Emma appeared beside him, also dressed for the storm. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "You can't handle all of this alone." Thomas wanted to tell Emma that it was too dangerous for her to go outside, but he could see the determination in her eyes. He also knew that she was right. He would need help to get the cattle to safety and repair the damaged fence before morning. Together, they stepped out into the storm. The wind was so strong that it nearly knocked them off their feet, and the rain soaked through their clothes within minutes. But Emma and Thomas worked as a team, using lanterns to guide the frightened cattle back to the safety of the barn and the stronger sections of the pasture. The hardest job was fixing the hole that had been torn in the barn roof by a falling tree branch. Thomas had to climb up on a ladder while Emma held it steady and handed him the tools and materials he needed. Several times, the wind nearly blew him off the roof, but Emma's steady voice calling out encouragement gave him the strength to keep working. They worked through the entire night, stopping only for brief moments to catch their breath or warm their hands. By the time the sun began to rise, they had managed to save all the animals and make the necessary repairs to keep the ranch secure. As the storm finally passed and the morning light revealed the extent of the damage, Emma and Thomas sat together on the porch steps, exhausted but proud of what they had accomplished. Their clothes were muddy and torn. Their hands were scratched and sore, but they were both smiling with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Emma," Thomas said quietly, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind all night, "I don't know what I would have done without you. You were incredibly brave out there." Emma looked at Thomas, seeing the genuine admiration and affection in his tired eyes. "Thomas," she replied, "you saved my life when I had nothing. But tonight, working beside you, I realized that you've given me something even more precious. You've shown me what it means to have a true partner." As they sat there watching the sunrise paint the desert in soft colors, both Emma and Thomas felt something shift between them. The shared experience of facing danger together had revealed the depth of their feelings for each other. They had moved beyond friendship into something that felt permanent and unbreakable. The winter had been long and cold, but now spring had finally arrived at the ranch. Emma and Thomas had worked together through the difficult months, keeping the cattle fed and healthy, repairing equipment that had been damaged by winter storms, and planning improvements they wanted to make to the property. During those winter evenings, sitting by the warm fire in the living room, their friendship had deepened into something that both of them recognized as true love. They had not spoken the words out loud yet, but their feelings were clear in the way they looked at each other, the way they worked together, and the comfortable silence they shared now. On a particularly beautiful morning in early April, the desert around their ranch had transformed into something magical. The winter rains had been generous this year, and the result was a spectacular display of wildflowers that covered the landscape in every direction. There were bright yellow desert marigolds, deep purple lupins, orange poppies, and delicate pink. Evening primroses creating a colorful carpet across the sandy ground. Emma had woken up early and was standing on the front porch, amazed by the beauty of the scene before her. She had never seen the desert look so alive and vibrant. Thomas joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of hot coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. "I've never seen anything so beautiful," Emma said softly, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Neither have I," Thomas replied, but he was looking at Emma rather than at the flowers. They walked together out into the meadow behind the house, where the wild flowers were especially thick. Emma knelt down to examine some of the delicate blossoms more closely, marveling at their perfect petals and sweet fragrance. Thomas watched her with a smile, thinking about how much his life had changed since the day he found her collapsed in the desert. Back then, Thomas had been a lonely man who worked hard but had little joy in his life. His days had been filled with necessary tasks, but there had been no laughter, no conversation, no shared dreams or plans. The ranch house had been clean and functional, but it had not felt like a real home. Emma had changed everything. She had brought warmth and happiness to every corner of his life. The house now felt alive with her presence. The meals they shared were delicious and filled with good conversation. The work they did together was enjoyable rather than just a burden to be endured. More than that, Emma had helped Thomas remember what it meant to hope for the future before she arrived. He had been focused only on getting through each day and keeping the ranch running. Now, he found himself making plans for next year, and the year after that, and many years beyond. As they stood together among the wildflowers, watching the sun climb high into the clear blue sky. Thomas knew that the time had come to speak the words that had been in his heart for months. His hands were shaking slightly as he turned to face Emma and gently took her hands in his. "Emma," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "I need to tell you something important." Emma looked into his eyes and saw the depth of feeling there. She had been hoping for this moment. But now that it was happening, her own heart was beating so fast that she could barely breathe. "When I found you in the desert that day," Thomas continued, "I thought I was just doing what any decent person would do, helping someone who was in trouble. I never imagined that you would end up helping me even more than I helped you." Emma's eyes began to fill with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. "You've brought so much love and laughter into my life," Thomas said. "You've made this house feel like a real home again. You've helped me remember what it means to dream about the future and to believe that good things are possible." Thomas paused for a moment, gathering his courage for the most important words he had ever spoken. "Emma, I love you with all my heart. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Will you stay here with me forever and help me build a life that we can share together?" Emma could no longer hold back her tears, but her smile was radiant as she answered, "Yes, Thomas, yes, I will marry you. I love you too, and there is nowhere else in the world I would rather be than right here with you." Thomas pulled Emma into his arms, and they held each other tightly as the morning sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink round them. The desert flowers swayed gently in the warm breeze, as if they were celebrating this moment of perfect happiness. 3 months later, on a warm day in July, The little church in Cedar Creek was filled with people who had come to witness the wedding of Thomas and Emma. The same townspeople who had once turned Emma away now welcomed her warmly as one of their own. They had seen how happy she and Thomas made each other, and how hard they both worked to make their ranch successful. Emma wore a beautiful white dress that the women of the town had sewn for her as a wedding gift. The dress was simple but elegant, with delicate lace trim and pearl buttons. Thomas wore his father's best suit, which had been carefully cleaned and pressed for the occasion. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, as Thomas and Emma exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring.